بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على عبد الله ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. This is the second part of what has been a two-part lecture. It's probably the longest two-part lecture I ever remember doing, because it seems like it's taken 5 weeks to get to the second part. But this is the second part of a two-part lecture on the topic of how we can learn and how we can seek knowledge in Islam. And last time we sat together, we covered an introduction to seeking knowledge in Islam, and we covered some of the virtues of it. We covered some of the most important fundamental principles that seeking knowledge is built upon, and we also spoke about memorization. In this second part, insha'Allah ta'ala, we're going to talk about the element of learning which is related to understanding, gaining understanding. And as we said, gaining knowledge in Islam is based upon two fundamental things. It's based upon memorization and understanding, and you need both. We've spoken about memorization. We're going to come back to it a little bit during this lecture, inshallah. But primarily, we want to talk about today understanding. And it's not just understanding we want. We want detailed understanding. We want fiqh, because that's the meaning of the word fiqh, right? In Arabic, like the scholars of Arabic define the word fiqh as al-fahmu daqiq, precise understanding, really knowing the ins and outs of something. Not just having an overview. If you have an overview of something, you don't call it fiqh. You only call it fiqh when you have a detailed and deep and precise understanding of something. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man yuridillahu bihi khayra yufaqihu fid din." Whoever Allah wants good for, He gives him fiqh in the religion. Now, fiqh here doesn't mean fiqh as in how to pray and, like the rules of nikah. But fiqh here means precise, detailed, deep understanding of the religion of Islam. How do we achieve that? And we can put it another way, why don't we achieve it? Why is it that so many people come to lectures every week? Why is it that so many people listen to YouTube lectures or listen to lectures in the car, and yet they don't achieve al-fahmu daqiq? They don't get deep and detailed and precise understanding of Islam. There are 2 or 3 fundamental answers to that question. And from that, we can actually develop a program of how we can gain knowledge in Islam. The first principle is to understand that Islam is not based or is not one subject. Islam is not one subject. Islam is an umbrella word for many sciences which come together to build Islamic knowledge. If we have knowledge in part of those sciences or one of those sciences, but we don't have knowledge in the other parts, then this leads to us doing lots of learning but not having a lot of knowledge. So for example, as people with tastes, with things we like and things we don't like, we often gravitate towards a certain kind of lecture or a certain topic. So some of you, for example, on a particular topic, I've heard, so many lectures. But that topic is the only topic that you have listened to. Or broadly speaking, within the sciences of Islam, you focused upon one or two sciences. Like you've learned a lot about tafsir, but you're lacking in knowledge in the other areas. So it's very important as our first principle that we don't see Islam as one topic, but we see it as 10 or 15 smaller topics. And we don't just say, I go to a weekly lecture on Islam, but we ask ourselves, how many lectures do I attend in tafsir? How many lectures do I attend in hadith? How many lectures do I attend in fiqh? How many lectures do I attend in, for example, the Arabic language and its sciences? How many lectures do I attend in the supporting sciences of things like usul al-fiqh? I'm going to go through what all of these things are in a minute, inshallah. But you get the idea. Instead of saying to yourself, I attend a lecture about Islam once a week, start thinking, if you want to gain detailed knowledge of Islam, start dividing Islam up into sub-sciences, and then for each of those sub-sciences, ask yourself, have I learned something in that? Have I studied something in that? So what might these sub-sciences be? There are different ways of categorizing them, and even these can be broken down into smaller categories. So one that we've already spoken about is what I would broadly term Al-Quran wa ulumuh. Quran and the knowledge related to the Quran. You can break this down further into things that what we would call ulum al-Quran, the sciences of the Quran, how the Quran should be written and how the Quran, the history of how the Quran was recorded and how it was compiled and the different types of recitation and the different styles and things like that. And you can also have a separate topic and call it tafsir of the Quran. It's better to make tafsir a separate topic. So we could start with a topic and we'll call it the sciences of the Quran. And that is everything connected to the Quran except for tafsir. Except for tafsir. And the reason why I take tafsir out is such a big topic. When you put it in with everything else gets lost because it's such a big topic. So within the topic of ulum al-Quran, to talk about how the Quran was revealed, how the Quran was collected, and the different styles and ways of reciting the Quran and things like that, that would all be within the topic of the sciences of the Quran. Then we would talk about tafsir and all of the things that tafsir is. What is tafsir? Tafsir is a science which relates to understanding what Allah means by His speech, or what Allah wants you to take from His speech. That is the concept of tafsir. So far we've got two. We could divide it in other ways, but that will do for now. We'll put a third one in there. We'll put the topic of creed or belief or aqeedah, what you believe as a Muslim, what you believe about Allah, what you believe about the angels, what you believe about the last day, the things that you believe in as a Muslim. And that again could be divided into many subcategories, but for now we'll leave it as one big category. Then we go on and we can say, for example, the science of hadith. The science of hadith. So the science of hadith is that which relates to what the Prophet ﷺ said and what he did and what he approved of and his description. And then we can go on and we can talk about the science of fiqh. And by fiqh here, I mean the specific, like the technical meaning, not the general meaning of understanding, but the technical meaning. So fiqh deals with, I think it's interesting to think about it like this. It deals with the details. It deals with the details, the detailed rulings that are taken from Islamic texts. When I raise my hands, where should I raise my hands to in the prayer? Is it obligatory for me to say a certain thing, or is it a recommendation? What are the pillars of the prayer and the obligatory parts of the prayer and the voluntary parts of the prayer? this comes under the topic of fiqh. We can talk about the Arabic language, and we could divide the Arabic language up into subcategories. I would say if you're an Arabic speaker, you should divide Arabic up into an-nahu, was-sarf, wal-balagha, and all of the different subsciences of Arabic. If you're not an Arabic speaker, then your only concern at the moment with that topic is learning to speak Arabic, as opposed to the subsciences of it. And then, when we look at these sort of major categories, we see things that come along and support them. So tafsir has to be built upon something. You could ask the question, okay, I'm reading the tafsir of the Quran, but where did the tafsir of the Quran come from? And so we have a science which deals with the principles or the way that tafsir is done. And we call this usul at-tafsir, the fundamentals behind the science of tafsir. Likewise, fiqh has the same thing. So in fiqh, you're reading other people's rulings and opinions and ideas about things and what's halal and what's haram and what's recommended and what's disliked. But there has to be a supporting science behind that. There has to be a set of rules and principles that tell you why something becomes haram, why something becomes an obligation, and we call this usul al-fiqh, the fundamentals of fiqh. And hadith as well. How is a hadith authentic or inauthentic? There has to be a supporting science which tells us whether hadith is authentic or not, which tells us how we judge that, and we call it usul al-hadith, or we call it mustalah al-hadith, the science of hadith. So we see that for every one of these sort of major topics, there is a helper topic. And the purpose of that helper subject is to give you the principles and the framework with which the subject is understood. So you need that as well. So when you start going through these things, you see that Islam is broken up into these different topics, and then you start to see lectures and books in a different way. Because you start to see these lectures and books, instead of being a book about Islam, this is a book about hadith. This is a book of fiqh. This is a book of tafsir. This is a book of aqeedah or creed or belief. This is a book of the science of the Quran. This is a book on the science of hadith. This is a book on the fundamental principles from which fiqh is derived. And so you see Islam as sub-sciences, as different topics. And that is one of the biggest things that will change your understanding of Islam. And it will show you where you have limitations. Even listening to me explain that, there will be some subjects I mentioned that some of you will say, I never heard of that topic before. And if that's the case, that probably shows that there is a weakness in that topic for you. Because, for example, when I said tafsir, most of you said, okay, yeah, tafsir, I know about that. Maybe when I said usul al-fiqh, the fundamentals of fiqh, quite a lot of people said, okay, what's that? So that shows us that we probably have some deficiencies in that regard. Is it necessary to become an expert in all of those? It's not necessary. Are all of those equal? No, they're not all equal. Some are more important than others. What you believe is a lot more important than the principles that tafsir is based upon, for example. But you need to try to see Islam as being different topics rather than, or different sciences, rather than one big subject. And this will show you where you have some deficiencies, and it will allow you to become much more knowledgeable about Islam. How far you take each one of those subjects is up to you. But what I would say is you should at least have a basic to intermediate understanding of all of them. Not just one of them or two of them. Because Islam, even though we divided it, now I'm going to say something that may sound slightly contradictory, even though we've divided Islam into all of these little sciences, actually Islam is one big topic. one big science. And so these sciences support each other. So when you learn hadith, it helps you in your tafsir. And when you learn the principles of tafsir, those same principles are repeated in the principles of fiqh, for example. And when you learn Arabic, it makes your tafsir better. And it makes your understanding of hadith better. And when you learn fiqh and rulings in Islam, it supports the knowledge that you have gained in other parts of these Islamic sciences. So it is important to have at least a basic understanding of each one of these sciences. At least know what it is. Even if you don't want to study it, at least have an idea what it is. At least understand where it starts. And this brings me to my second major point. My first one is don't see Islam as one big topic. See Islam as lots of smaller sciences. The second major thing that you need to develop good understanding of Islam is you need to go in stages. So you need in each one of those sciences to start at the very beginning. And one of the biggest problems we have is we switch on YouTube, we listen to a lecture, but that lecture may well not be at the beginning of what that person needs to start the topic off. So they're listening to a lecture about hadith, but there is a chunk of material that they haven't studied from the beginning of the topic. Not from the book specifically, but in terms of books themselves, you can think of it like a bookshelf. On this bookshelf, each shelf represents a topic in Islam. So you have a shelf for belief, a shelf for hadith, a shelf for tafsir, a shelf for fiqh, a shelf for usul al-fiqh, a shelf for the science of hadith, and so on. On each shelf, you have to order the books from easy to difficult. And what happens is often if you start reading books from the middle of the shelf, you get confused because those books are based upon what has preceded from the beginning of the bookshelf. And so it's really important when you learn Islam that you start at the beginning in each topic. And that's difficult. It requires you to be almost a connoisseur of Islamic sciences and knowledge, not just somebody who picks out a YouTube video and says, I'll watch this. That's fine if you just want general topics to raise your iman, but it's not going to give you detailed understanding of Islam. It's not going to give you precise knowledge of what Islam is and what Islam isn't. It's only just going to give you a bit of knowledge about something, which is, it's kind of like ripping a page out of one of the books and, sticking it on your wall. There's a bit of knowledge there, but you don't have the context of where that knowledge belongs and how it links to the knowledge that came before it and the knowledge that's coming after it. So you have to be strict with yourself and you have to start at the very beginning. And what you want at the beginning is you want a book which gives you an overview of the topic and introduces you to terminology. This is what you really want. You want a book that gives you an overview of the topic, as in it gives you a brief, like sort of a bird's eye view of the topic you're going to study, and it gives you terminology, because each one of these sub-sciences has its own terminology. And let me just give you an example. The word sunnah has maybe 7 or 8 different meanings. In every science, it means something different. So if you hear a scholar of Aqidah or you're reading a book of Aqidah, a book of creed about Islam, belief, and they talk about sunnah, then the sunnah means the opposite of bid'ah, the opposite of innovation. Any person, sunnah meaning having the belief, the correct belief, as opposed to an innovated and introduced belief. If you see the word sunnah in a book of hadith, then it means what was reported from the Prophet ﷺ, from his statements and actions and approvals and his description. If you see the word sunnah in a book of fiqh, then often what it means are those things which you are rewarded for doing, but you are not under a threat of punishment if you don't do them. Yani voluntary acts. So have you noticed that each time we go to a different science, the word means something different. And so what you need from your introductory book is a bit of terminology and a bird's eye view of what that subject looks like and what that subject kind of, something to get you almost like, I would describe it like a bunch of keys. What you need in the beginning is a bunch of keys. What I mean by that, something small that you can hold, each one of them will open a door of information. Each one of them will open a door. And what's behind that door are volumes and volumes of information. But all you just have is a little key. You remember the key and you have access to the door and everything that's behind it. So for example, give you a simple example. When you memorize the names of Allah, you memorize the names of Allah. And maybe you memorize them in some sort of poetry form where you can keep them in your memory easily. Each one of those names opens a volume of information which you can remember and you can have stored in your memory. You don't have to memorize that whole volume of information. You only need to memorize the name, and the name unlocks a part of your memory which has lots of sort of information in it, and from there you can memorize a small amount and get access to a big amount. So this is what you want from a beginner's level book. What you don't want from a beginner's level book are differences in opinion. You definitely don't want to know that this person said that it's black and this person said that it's white, because that is going to lead to you getting confused. You want one opinion, and you don't want a lot of complexity. You don't want it to be really complicated. You want a basic, nice introductory book that gives you terminology, gives you an overview, doesn't give you any differences of opinion, and doesn't overcomplicate things for you. Something you can refer back to again and again. And often it's the case that we actually memorize that initial book. Some of those initial books are so succinct and so compressed and easy to understand that you can actually memorize that first book.
You will relate to whatever you will learn
and whatever you learn later will relate to something that you have memorized from that initial text and that initial book. As you progress on, you're going to first of all need to understand the evidence. So that's probably in the intermediate level. You would have a book that not only tells you what to do or an introduction to the topic, but gives you some of the evidence, a little bit more complexity. And then you progress to a book that gives you some differences of opinion, maybe has some incorrect opinions in it, which you have to unravel and unlock, and so on and so on. As you go through the stages, the complicated books become easy because they're built upon things that you have already understood and you've already taken on board. This now brings me to the third important point. So the first one we said, see Islam as a series of sciences, not one big topic. The second thing we said is go in stages. Start at the very, very beginning and move onwards and onwards and onwards. The third is keep a record of your study and have a plan. And the two of those can go together. A plan, a study plan, and a personal record of what you've studied. Now, the reason I say this, I think it's especially important because most of us don't have access to a teacher full-time, in the sense that we are not sitting at the feet of our teacher with a notepad and writing down everything that he says. In that case, you don't need to worry as much about a study plan because your teacher is giving you everything you need. Most of us are part-time students. We study whenever we get time, whenever we get an evening, a little bit at the weekend. And we often change teachers. We don't have one teacher that we're glued to and we sit at his feet or her feet all day and everything that she gives us, we take it. that is easier in a way, but we often have many teachers. So we might have 6 or 7 people whose lectures we attend. And we're kind of learning also from someone on YouTube, and maybe distance learning, and maybe we're doing a course here and a university, Islamic online degree over here, and we kind of have everything everywhere. So it's really important to have a single cohesive plan that you follow and a record of what you've studied. Because what you can do is 2 things. You can get your teacher to develop that plan for you in a way that makes it easy for you to follow, even if your teacher is not there. And the second thing you can do is you can keep showing it to people and getting feedback. So what I would do, you don't have to do it like this, but what I do, 1 A4 page per book. And the A4 pages are slotted into a ring binder. It can be on the iPad or whatever. It doesn't have to be a real one, but are slotted into a ring binder. And there are subject dividers. The subject dividers represent these subjects like tafsir, hadith, fiqh, aqidah, and so on. And within them, I've tried to order it easy book, next one, next one, next one, next one. The front page, I usually have a plan of all the books I'm going to study on that topic up to a certain level. So I have a folder for level 1, a folder for level 2, a folder for level 3, and onwards. What I can do at any one time is when I take the book, books have different ways of learning them, right? So you can read a book, you can learn a book from a teacher, you can have like a private sitting, or you can go to a public class, or you can learn it online, or you can watch a video, or listen to audio. And every one of those that I do for that book, I will write it down on that piece of paper. So I will say, this book, which is the book of Kitab al-Arba'in al-Nawawiyya, the 40 hadith of Imam al-Nawawi. I have studied it from this person on this date at this center, and I finished up to hadith number whatever, and I read this book which explains it, and I've watched these videos on this topic, and I keep like a record of what I've done. Then when I see my teacher, who I don't see all the time, and I see maybe a different teacher for each topic, I say, Sheikh, this is what I've studied, this is what I've read, this is what that I've been through, where do I go next? He said, right, next you need to read this book. Next, I see you haven't done the explanation of this person. You need to finish that as well. Because you may do a book multiple times. Because even within books themselves, there are levels. There is someone who explains the 40 hadith of Imam al-Nawawi in one sitting or in one day. We did it in Kalima, I think, in 2 days. And there are some that explain every hadith in a day. So 40 days. And there are some that explain it even longer. There are some that have 60, 70 or 100 hours explaining those 40 hadith. So even in one book, you start by studying it a very basic way, and then you move up to the next level, and then you move up to the next level. And so when you show the teacher can look at your study plan and can say to you, you need to do this and you need to do that. And this is particularly relevant when we talk about my next point, which is integrating Arabic and English. So if you've taken on board what I've said about these 3 points, you're going to notice that there is a difficulty involved. And that is that to really get that in each of those sciences, you need to read books in Arabic. Because let's be honest, you might not even barely find a book on Usul al-Fiqh in English, let alone be able to read one, or let alone be able to read many of them. So that being said, what I suggest for people who are not Arabic speakers is that what you do is you have basically you have a blend. You start by you're learning Arabic, and as you're learning Arabic, you're reading books in English. The more Arabic you know, the more you switch over to books that are written in Arabic, by the time you've done 3 years worth of books in English and you've finished all the books that there are to finish in English, then in terms of, study books, then you can move on to Arabic, because by that time your Arabic is good enough to transition yourself from English into Arabic, especially because the beginning books you're going to do in Arabic are going to be simple ones. They're going to be basic ones. They're not going to be very complicated. So that is what I suggest people do. You start by learning Arabic, and while you're learning Arabic, you're studying these books in English. Alhamdulillah, most of the books, at least at a basic level, most of the level 1 books are available in English. And maybe half of the level 2 books are available in English. And none of the level 3 books are available in English, or almost none of them. So in that case, what you would do is you would get yourself on a good Arabic program. And while you are learning Arabic, you're finishing off as many books in English as you can. And then you transition from English into Arabic, and you continue on in Arabic as best you can. We'll come back to Arabic in a moment. So we said about having a study plan, showing the study plan to your teacher, and keeping a record of what you've done, because that allows you to evaluate, where am I on this path? And ideally, you should have a teacher develop your plan for you, because your teacher knows which books are best to read and can put together a plan that you can easily study and benefit from, and also can give you feedback on that plan. There isn't one study plan that is right. That's not the case. In fact, different teachers from different places in the world with different perspectives will give you different plans. And I'll give you one example. I took one study plan from my teacher in Saudi, and I took another one from a student of knowledge from Somalia. The one from Saudi was about 3 times bigger than the one from Somalia, okay? But the one from Somalia, it was expected that every book you will study it down to the last comma and full stop, and you will, like, down to even the fact that you will answer questions on grammar in every book that you study, and you'll go into it with a microscope. And the Saudi one, it's expected that you'll just skim over each book, but you'll do more. Neither of those two are, one of them is not right and one of them is not wrong. It is simply down to what that particular teacher, the style that they have. So one style is you study very few books. Maybe you finish level 1, 2, and 3 with only, in every subject, you might only do 3 books or 4 books. But each one of those books, you do it down to the point where every comma and every full stop, you study it. And the other style, you maybe do 10 or 12 books in that space, but you don't go into as much detail. You skim over them and you learn what's missing from the first one, you get in the second, what's missing from the second, you get in the third. But the point is that the teacher gives you a set or a series or a plan to follow. And if you follow that plan, you end up having solid understanding in every sub-science of Islam. Now, back to my first point that I made. It's not necessary for you to study in great detail every one of those sciences. But we did say that it's needed to have at least a basic understanding, if not an intermediate understanding, in all of them. Once you get beyond that basic intermediate level, it's up to you if you want to push it further, or if you want to suffice yourself with, look, that's it. What I've taken is enough. Again, in consultation with your teacher, you ask your teacher, I feel like I've done enough of this. It's not my main, interest. I'm happy with what I've done. Is it okay if I stop here? Teacher says, yeah, you can stop there if that's what you want to do. And other subjects you have a real passion for, and you take them much further into, till you're reading like books that are 50 volumes or 30 volumes or something like that. So there's a lot of progression that you can make. Just to give you an example, let me give you an example in something that we might be a bit familiar with. Let's talk about hadith. How would this progression look in hadith? For me, if I was putting together a study plan for someone in hadith, I would start them off probably with the 40 hadith of Al-Imam An-Nawawi, rahimahullah ta'ala. So that's 50 hadith in total, including the addition of Ibn Rajab. It's 50 hadith in total. They are quite short, easy to memorize, and they are very, very important in the religion. In fact, they're the most important hadith in the whole religion. I would start with that. I would tell my student to memorize each one of those hadith in Arabic and to study the understanding of them in English, but not necessarily to memorize the understanding, just to memorize the hadith themselves and to work on the understanding later on. I would then take them, after the 40 hadith, into a book of ahadith al-ahkam, the hadith that relate to the halal and the haram. Now, depending on the energy of the student, I'd give them two choices. If they're a little bit, if they're not so keen, like they just want, they're happy to go on the slow road, I would give them something like Umdatul Ahkam. So it's a collection of ahadith which relate to rulings in Islam. Hadith on prayer, hadith on fasting, hadith on zakah, hadith on hajj, hadith on marriage, hadith on, and so on. If the student had a bit more energy and really wanted to memorize a lot and study a lot, I would tell them go to Bulugh al-Maram, which is the same kind of book, but there's a lot more, the content is a lot more. And we study Bulugh al-Maram, we teach it on a Wednesday in Sharifat al-Attar Masjid in Al-Barsha. So beginning to end, I would tell them to do Bulugh al-Maram. Now that's not going to it's not going to be quick. It might take them 3 years to finish that book from beginning to end. They're doing other things in the meantime, other topics in the meantime, but if they're doing it once or twice a week, it might take them 3 or even 4 years or even more to finish that book from beginning to end. And memorization would be according to the person, how much energy they have to memorize. If they have energy to memorize, really, they really want to memorize, start them memorizing Bulugh al-Maram. If they don't feel the energy to memorize Bulugh al-Maram, give them something smaller. Give them just the topic of ibadat from Umdatul Ahkam, just the topic of salah and zakah and hajj and fasting, for example. And then we would probably take them to Al-Lu'lu' wal-Marjan, فيما اتفق عليه الشيخان, which is a book called Al-Lu'lu' wal-Marjan. It's available also in English. In that which Bukhari and Muslim agreed upon. In all of the ahadith that are agreed upon by both Bukhari and Muslim. Memorize them and understand them. And then, if they still have energy after that, I would say you're done from the intermediate level. If you still have energy, start doing the 6 books of hadith from beginning to end. Muslim, Al-Bukhari, Abu Dawud, At-Tirmidhi, An-Nasa'i, Ibn Majah, beginning to end. But that's for those who have more energy. So the point is, I would put together a plan that looks something like that. I might put some things in between and some books and explanations, but I put a plan that looks something like that. The student will do their best to follow that plan. Now they might themselves not be able to study all of those in classes. For example, if they're living in Dubai, there is a class for Bulugh al-Maram. So you can go to the class. You don't need to study it from YouTube because you have a class that you can go to and you can sit at. And this brings me to my next principle, which is not every method of seeking knowledge is equal in weight. Okay? The best kind of seeking knowledge is where you have a private sitting with a teacher or a small group. You read the book to the teacher and you make notes on the book from the teacher. This is the best kind. Followed by public classes. Followed by distance learning, followed by video, followed by audio, followed by books. So we started with private sittings or small groups with the teacher. Can you get it? Yeah, sure you can. Just have to push people and ask people. And especially when the teacher sees you've got energy. Sheikh, I've been told that I have to memorize the 40 hadith of Imam al-Nawawi. Is it okay if I can come and read them to you and you can give me a short explanation and I've got 5 or 6 other brothers who want to come as well? People feel energy. When you see a student like that, you want to do it for them. You're like, okay, maybe someone might say, I don't have time, but this other brother is doing it. People want to do it. They want to help people out. But when someone comes and says, I just want to learn something about Islam, I need to get knowledge, I want to go and study abroad, you have less energy to help them because you see that they're not putting as much work in from their side. If you can't get that private sitting, which is true many times, the person will say, I'm too busy. See how many of those books can you get in public classes, where you have a class here, a class there. Now people at this point are going to say it's hard. It is hard. You're going to have to give up your time. You're going to have to travel sometimes some distance to get it. You might have to sit in an uncomfortable masjid or on a floor for, an hour or 2 hours. But there's a very famous saying from the scholars of old, which goes that knowledge is not gained by resting your body. You don't gain knowledge by feeling comfortable, and you have to be a little bit uncomfortable. You have to work a little bit hard. You can't get it in a class. Is it possible to get it? Distance learning. Distance learning meaning you are a student in a class, but you're not physically there. You're attending the class live online or something like that. If it's not possible, is it possible for you to watch a video? Why do I say that a video is better? Why do I say that a video is better than audio? Because a video is as close to being in a class as you can be. You feel like you're in the class, right? You see the teacher and you really feel like you're there. Then audio, and finally, reading a book. Reading a book is bottom of the list. You'll still have to do it sometimes, but it's bottom of the list when it comes to reading a book. If you get your knowledge from reading a book, it's very important that you make notes of questions of things you didn't understand, because it's much easier to misunderstand a book than it is to misunderstand a teacher. Because the teacher says things again and again and looks at your eyes, do you understand what I'm saying? And repeats and kind of sees everyone following me and answers questions at the end. But with a book, you don't get any of that. So it's really important when you learn from a book that you write a list of questions and you take that list to your teacher and you say to your teacher, I've been through this book and I came across this statement on this page. Could you explain it to me? I feel like I didn't understand. And so on. And like this, with a lot of dedication and a lot of hard work, you start to build up your knowledge in Islam. And you build it up to such a level where you can begin to delve into the bigger books. See, right now, everything we're talking about are still, even though we're talking about beginner, intermediate, advanced, they're still fairly small books. I mean, we said, Bulugh al-Maram, and we said Al-Lu'lu' wal-Marjan. They're still they're books you can hold in your hand. They're just one volume. But later on, you start going into books that are of many volumes, that contain many difficult issues and so on. And again, ideally reading to a teacher. But if you can't read to a teacher, then, you do your best with what you can. Added to that is the traditional Islamic system of ijazat, getting an ijazah in something, which is where you feel you've studied a book to a certain level. You go to a teacher, you study from the teacher, and at the end, the teacher gives you a permission in that book. What we call an ijazah, gives you like a letter or a document which says that you have the permission, sometimes it's verbal, that you have the permission to teach this book, or that you have understood this book properly. And even if you're not studying in a formal Islamic institution, you can gather these from different teachers. And you can develop, sort of like a little portfolio or a personal record of knowledge. Bearing in mind what I said the first time about implementing, how implementing knowledge is the most important thing. It's the most important thing. And so going like this, that is how you develop detailed understanding in Islam. Now someone might say, how does this apply to my children? Because what you're saying sounds very complicated, and it doesn't have to be that complicated. Same thing with your kids. What do we do with our kids? What's the standard thing? Just get them to memorize Quran. That's it. But if we start to apply this, so they're memorizing some Quran, they're memorizing some hadith, they're doing the tafsir, starting with maybe a basic tafsir of Juz Amma, for example, and then progressing onwards to a little bit more complicated, and in terms of belief, they started studying that maybe they begin with just the pillars of Iman in a basic way, and then they move on to something a bit more complicated and a bit more complicated. And if we do that, our kids get a rounded education of what Islam is. So these principles, you can make them as complicated or as easy as you want. They don't have to be super complicated. You can, if you don't want to go to that crazy level, that really difficult level, you can go to a simple level. But you still have to see Islam as being different topics. You still have to start with the basics and move upwards. And you still have to keep a record of what you're studying and what you're planning to study. Otherwise, you're just collecting YouTube videos. That's all you're doing. And it's not you're not gaining any more knowledge. You're not becoming a person of knowledge. You're just getting information from here and from there, and you're just getting by. I'm managing okay. You know, I'm learning how to pray in a basic way. I'm sort of learning the basics of what I need to do as a Muslim, but I'm not learning in the way that those ahadith talk about, you know, the way that makes Jannah easy for you, and the way that, you know, you benefit other people and yourself, you remove ignorance from yourself and others and so on. You're not getting that unless you study in some detail and with some structure. And what's interesting is that if you think about what I've said today, it's not that different from how you study anything really. It's like what I've said today is not that unfamiliar to you, whatever you've studied. If you studied engineering, it's probably pretty much the same kind of principles, whether you recognize it or whether you don't, that you started by dividing the topic up into, you know, subtopics. So if you studied maths, for example, you know, you had calculus and you had, you know, whatever, you had, you know, algebra, and you had trigonometry, and you had all these different like divisions. You broke it up into subjects, and you started off with the easy stuff, and then you went up to the more difficult stuff. And, you know, the different methods of learning, you know, you kept a record. If you didn't keep a record, then your school kept a record of what you had studied, and or your university kept a record of what you had studied and what you hadn't studied, and so on. So these principles are fundamental principles of learning. Like, they apply to everything, but we have to be careful when it comes to Islam, because if we don't get that or we don't follow that way, then what happens is you waste a lot of time. You waste a lot of time. And you've watched hours and hours and hours and hours of videos and attended lecture after lecture after lecture, but it's not moving you anywhere. Bearing in mind what I said about the importance of acting upon the knowledge that you have. It's not just about gaining knowledge, but about putting it into practice as well. I wanted to talk now for 5 minutes, summarize a conversation I had with a brother on the topic of Arabic. So when I say Arabic here, I'm talking about Arabic for non-Arabic speakers. Arabic for Arabic speakers is easy. So we divide Arabic into al-nahu and al-sarf and al-balagha and whatever other things we need to divide it into. And in al-nahu we have a set of books that we follow. In al-sarf we have a set of books we follow. In al-balagha we have a set of books that we follow. And we finish the Arabic, you know, we finish our study of the Arabic language. That's easy for people who are Arabic speakers. But I'm talking about people who are not Arabic speakers. What is the best way to learn Arabic? And this is a difficult one. There are lots of things available, and each one of them has pros and cons. So there are live classes, as in classes where you turn up as a student, you sit at a desk and you study. There are online teachers. There are books and videos and CDs and whatever else, MP3s and whatever else there are. And there's kind of like a mix and a hybrid and self-study and lots of other things. But there are some things that I think are really fundamental to learning Arabic, which I was discussing with a brother earlier on today, and I'm just going to summarize a few of them for you. The first is, and probably the easiest of all of them, is vocabulary. Get yourself a good vocabulary list. Put it on flashcards and start learning words. Even if you don't know how to put a sentence together. So you look around the room, there's a table, microphone, a stand, piece of paper, a pencil, tissues, a sofa, a carpet, a door, lights, a camera, a bookshelf, books, curtains, blinds, whatever. Each one of those has a word for it in Arabic. Just go learn the words. Get yourself a good vocabulary list and go and learn the words. You don't need a teacher to do it, to be honest. You can do it from just like flashcards, you know, like picture on one side and word on the other. Test yourself. Do 5 words a day, 10 words a day. Most languages only need 3,000 words to reach fluency. Even if you say that Arabic needs double that, let's just say Arabic needs 6,000 words for fluency. It's very achievable to do 10 words a day. 10 words a day and 2 years, and you know, like you've done a lot. You've done a lot. So I would say the first thing is vocabulary. The second thing is what some of the specialists in the science call corpus learning, where you have some material that you gain exposure to the language from. That can be written, it can be audio, it can be video, but it should be some material, and it should be graded by difficulty, meaning you start at the beginning, which is very simple, and it gets harder as you go on. An example of that I gave earlier on today is, for example, children's reading books. You know, I don't know in Arabic what they call them, but in English you have like the Oxford Reading Tree and these different sort of books where they start you with, you know, the cat sat on the mat, and then they, you know, go up to like paragraphs and pages. In Arabic, similar things exist. For native speakers, you know, book 1A, and it starts with, you know, the Arabic equivalent of the cat sat on the mat, you know, very, very simple words and simple to understand. And then it gets to very complicated sentences as you go on through the book. So that's an example of reading. For videos, even things like kids' cartoons, you start with cartoons aimed at 3 to 4 year olds, and then 5 to 6 year olds, and then 6 to 7 year olds, and then, you know, for example, anything where you can get access to the language structured, where you're getting like each one is getting more complicated than the previous one. For audio, it's a little bit more difficult, but again, you might be able to find Arabic course audio or something where it starts off simple and it gets more complicated. So expose yourself to the language, starting off easy and getting more complicated. And the third thing you need is you need a little bit of grammar. I'm starting to kind of come around to the opinion that it's better to start with very little grammar and only take what you need, because grammar tends to put people off. It's good, but it tends to put people off the language. So maybe that's a case of having a teacher or having a class, and you just learn enough. You just learn, you know, enough to move to the next book, to the next sentence, to the next topic, and so on. And that way, I think, is, in terms of the structure, is the best way of learning the language. Now, whether you do that as a student in a class, or online, or by yourself, is up to you. But you need to have those fundamental components. You need to have vocabulary that you learn. You need to have a corpus, a body of material that exposes you to the language. And you need to have some knowledge about how to make sentences, syntax and grammar, which you probably get from a teacher, either, you know, online, in book form, or whatever it is. For a lot of people, the reason they get put off is because in the beginning, it's a little hard. And that's why I say in the beginning, just start with 2 or 3 words a day. Just start with vocabulary, right? Isn't it like little kids? When you get a little baby, the first thing they start with is vocabulary, right? They don't come out with sentences to begin with. It's like mama, baba, you know, ball, cat. You know, they learn vocabulary. And then they start putting, you know, very simple sentences together. And then, you know, you progress from there. There does come a point where you feel more at home with the language. And that's when things start to get a little bit easier. But you have to persevere until you get to that point. The last point that I'll mention is, a lot of people say, what about pronunciation and speaking? I think to begin with, just a good Quran teacher is enough to begin with. A good Quran teacher who's strict on pronunciation will teach you to read and pronounce the letters properly. That's a good start. And then as you develop in your Arabic, you can take breaks. If you don't have access to a native speaker, you can kind of maybe go have a break, go have a week in an Arabic speaking country or Arabic speaking area. Dubai is not great for that because English is the medium that everybody uses, but there are areas of the UAE where you'll have more exposure to Arabic. Go and but you don't have to be there all the time. Just go every now and again and practice what you've learnt, and then you come back and you keep going. And if you have an online teacher, you could do it through the online medium as well. So I think even with kids, what I do with my kids is primarily vocabulary, mostly. It's working on just words for things and slowly introducing very simple sentences, really simple, and take your time. And like they say, and the famous Arabic saying goes, "Man jadda wajad," the one who works hard will get it in the end. You just have to show that dedication and that hard effort and that hard work. So going back to linking the two classes together, this is one of the last points I'm going to make. To link the last two classes together, what you need to do is to link memorization and understanding. As an adult, as we said, as a child, what did we say last time? A child, you can give them lots of memorization and just a little bit of understanding. But for an adult, you have to give lots of understanding and just a little bit of memorization, because adults, for us, memorization is a little bit more difficult, right? So you start by memorizing more than just Quran, Hadith, and some basic Islamic books. Very simple, like we said, the beginner's level. Just the Hadith out of them, just the ayat out of them. Book 1, Book 2, Book 3, Book 4. And before long, you'll see that even 6 months of doing that, you will be a totally different person in terms of your Islamic knowledge. After 6 months of doing that, you'll feel like you got more in that 6 months than the previous 6 years. Because you started learning with structure, in stages, beginning, middle, end, and you combined between memorizing and understanding. So you've committed at least some things to memory. So you've got some things in your heart, and the rest of it, you've got a good working understanding of. This is what I think is a good, or this is like what I would put forward as an introduction to the way of, or to the method of studying Islam. What remains to be said is that every one of you is an individual. You each have your own time commitments. You each have your own priorities. You're each at a different level of understanding and a different level of iman. And so it's not what works for one person will not necessarily work for everybody. But I've tried to give you general ideas. How far you take that is up to you. So a new Muslim who just became Muslim 2 months ago is probably not going to go into as much detail as someone who's been studying for quite a while and is really now looking to take it to the next level. But still the same thing is going to apply. They're still going to look at Islam as different parts. They're still going to start with the basics and go forwards. And they're still going to keep a record of what they've studied and try to move with some degree of progression with the help of a teacher. Like I said, if you can't have a permanent teacher, at least have people who give you advice from time to time, at a minimum. And if you do that, inshallah ta'ala, I think you'll find yourself to be a lot more productive in the way that you learn Islam. And my last point, a lot of people are under the probably mistaken impression that to do this, you have to be a member of an institute or a university, or you have to go somewhere and study it. Actually, most of this is something they won't even teach you in a university. Even if you went to an Islamic university, they wouldn't necessarily teach you what I've taught you in these 2 lessons. They might just say to you, just follow what we're teaching you and, and graduate, and that's it. So in reality, it's not the case that you have to do that. You just have to have enough discipline to follow a plan instead of just listening to what you feel like listening to. What you feel like listening to might raise your iman, might be iman booster, but it's not going to develop your knowledge in detail so that you have that detailed understanding of Islam that makes the path to Jannah easy. I think that is those are most of the points that I wanted to cover. At the moment, I have a good plan in Arabic. I have a good Arabic study plan. But my English study plan at the moment, I'm working on it because I'm trying to find that blend between the English books and the Arabic books. I'm going to put something online, inshallah, and I'm even planning to do a project whereby we translate the scholars teaching each one of these books at different levels, and people can actually follow it, and they can go step by step. Kalima has the Essentials program, which is supposed to be like a mini version of what I've described to you. It's not the Essentials program is not everything. It's a Friday morning program. It's not like everything I've described, but it's supposed to be like at least an introduction to it. It's supposed to at least give you an idea. So that's something, if people want to take it further, they could consider the Friday morning program. And I'm sure many of the other Islamic centers have more detailed and structured learning programs that people can follow on a regular basis. Those who want to get in touch with me and get some of the programs or get an idea, I think I'm going to publish something online first of all because it makes sense. And then if people have specific questions, they can ask about them, inshallah ta'ala. Like I said, at the moment, I have a good one in Arabic, but my English one is a bit lacking because what I found is it's just finding that blend between English and Arabic for the non-Arabic speakers is a little bit difficult, but it's something that you have to work on, inshallah. I hope that there has been in these two lectures something for everyone to take away, regardless of the level that you're at. Maybe not everybody will benefit from everything, but maybe there are takeaways there. There are things you can say, all right, okay, that bit I benefited from, that I could definitely implement, this I could do. So inshallah, that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made easy. In terms of my classes at GILC, this will be the last one of mine before Ramadan, because by the time we go to the next third week of May, we'll be into Ramadan. So we won't have classes in Ramadan. After Ramadan, we'll see what Allah Azza wa Jal makes easy. I don't know what the plan is, but I'm sure those guys will let you know about it. And if anyone wants to catch me before then I have my usual classes with Kalima, which you can follow and you can find on their website, inshallah ta'ala. Okay, questions? Who has some questions on this topic, or on any topic really, to be honest? It doesn't have to be on this topic alone. Salam alaikum.
Thank you for everything. How long did it take you to learn Arabic when you first started?
So I learned Arabic full time. So you have to bear in mind when I give you the answer, I'm giving you the answer for full-time study. It took me 2 years to graduate full-time study and a year to build fluency. So the 2 years was like the vocab and the exposure to the language and grammar and syntax. And then a year of putting it into practice. Like a year of mixing with native speakers and just putting it into practice before I felt that I was at full speed. And I think everyone has to do it. If you're going to learn Arabic yourself, probably you'll get to a certain point, and after that you've just got to go and mix with people and implement it. But I don't think mixing with people at the beginning necessarily is all that helpful. You just kind of learn the language and the structure first, and then when you get to a certain amount of proficiency, you can go and mix with people and you can basically get up to a level of fluency. At least I think fluency is relative, to be honest. I'm not sure if we sat here discussing politics that my Arabic would be all that fluent, because you're fluent in what you are used to speaking about. But yeah, relative fluency, 2 years, 3 years, 2.5 years, something like that, inshallah. But that's full time. Part time, maybe double that. Maybe double that it would have taken. But that's still, 5 years. I mean, how many of you 5 years ago said, I'm going to learn Arabic, I'm going to learn Arabic, I'm going to learn Arabic, and 5 years later, you're still sitting here saying, I'm going to learn Arabic. So the point is that 5 years is still not that bad. It's a decent achievement. If in 5 years you finish and you get to a level of fluency in 5 or 6 years in Arabic, that's really something praiseworthy and achievable, inshallah. Who else has a question? From the sisters. That's true. I'm not sure about any specific university. Like I wouldn't be able to comment on one that I haven't been to. But when you attend an institute, you definitely get motivated. But what I kind of wanted to point out is you don't need to attend one. Like if you don't attend one, you can still learn. It's not that much of a barrier. You just have to be more dedicated to learning than if you attend one. But even if you attend an institute or a university, you still need to have this private study plan, because that university will not give you everything. In fact, what I described about the whole plan and all the different topics, even in a university where you do 4 years full-time study, you will not get even half of that, because the university has to stick to its terms, schedules. You know, for example, I went to Kulliyat al-Hadith, the faculty of Hadith in the Islamic University of Medina in Saudi Arabia. And imagine it's a faculty that specializes in Hadith. And we only covered like 150 Hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, 150 Hadith in Sahih Muslim, like 150 Hadith in each of the 4 Sunan, plus a full book of Hadith from beginning to end in rulings. But that's nothing. You know, that's a faculty that specializes in Hadith, and you're covering like 2,000 Hadith in total from beginning to end. In the Kutub al-Sitta, there are 33,000 and something odd Hadith in the 6 books of Hadith, of which you're covering 2,000. It's not even a drop in the ocean. So even when you go to a university, what you'll find is that university will not give you everything. They'll not give you a private study plan. They'll not take you through every book you need. They'll be doing a book and just do half of it, or just do 3 or 4 pages from it, or 10 pages from it, and then move on to another one. You have to still have the dedication to finish those books yourself and to seek help from the teacher outside of the university. Otherwise, the university itself, it doesn't give you everything you need. And that's why when people graduate from these famous Islamic universities, they don't graduate as scholars. That's why they don't graduate as scholars. Because ultimately, they're getting 10 pages out of a 600-page book. It's their responsibility as to whether they finish that book. The university is just going to give you the bits that you need. And after that, it's going to be your responsibility to take it further. That's why these institutes don't produce scholars, because they don't go from beginning to end, as opposed to the traditional Islamic way of learning, where you do go from beginning to end. You go from the beginning of the book to the end of the book, then you get an ijazah in the book. Then you go from the beginning of the book to the end of the next book and you get an ijazah. You go from the beginning to the end, you get... That way you do get scholars, because people literally finish all of the books under the guidance of a teacher, but that's not easy for everyone to do. So you make best use of what is available to you, but you still need to have your own study plan.
So in the older days, there were universities that they would finish like books and, or like, why would they, that sounds like a better plan. Why would they?
They changed in order to match the standards of Western academia. And that's not their fault. I mean, they wanted their students, when they graduate, to be able to say, you have graduated with something that is comparable to someone who graduated from engineering or someone who graduated from medicine. And they wanted it to be, comparable to the international standard. And so they put it into that. And also,
Do they have to do this? It's not that is what we are suffering even here with the schools. Because the schools here are all following like UK, America, their standards. Even the local school here is following the British government, which is only translated. So why wouldn't Muslims make programs for themselves the way that it suits them?
yeah, well, this is a very valid point. It's a very valid point. What Muslims had a system of study that was better than what exists in the universities today, and unfortunately, like Allah Azza wa Jalla said, تَسْتَبْدِلُونَ الَّذِي هُوَ أَدْنَى بِالَّذِي هُوَ خَيْرٌ. And they changed that which was good for that which was not as good. But at the same, we don't say there's no good in it. Alhamdulillah, I went to a university that it matched the Western qualification, but at the end of the day, it benefited a huge amount. I benefited immensely from it. It's just not the end of the road. And you can argue on the other side that the academic way of, the sort of Western academic way of studying opened up studying to lots more people, because actually sitting to get ijazat is really hard. It's extremely hard, it's extremely tiring, you get nothing out of it except ajr from Allah Azza wa Jal. And at the end of it, when you ask for a, you try and get a job in something, they say you're not qualified. And subhanAllah, so to a certain extent, everything has its place and its time. But for those who really want a more traditional Islamic education, you can still get that. That's still there. You just have to go out and look for it. It's not on a plate anymore. It's not like in front of your door.
Exactly what you said. I think we need institutes which has it on the plate, not for the certificate, so that maybe.
Yeah, this is a very, very valid point. May Allah make it easy.
Another point is that when you said what are the things that put people off, is because they find it hard. I think that's not really what puts people off. It's because lack of usage. Because if you go to China, maybe Chinese language is more difficult for us, but if you stay there 6 months, you learn the Chinese. And it's much more.
There's an element of that, definitely. And also the shaitan, it doesn't care if you learn Chinese or not. But the shaitan doesn't want you to learn the language of the Quran, because he doesn't want you to get yourself from the darkness into the light. So that's also one thing. And also, as Muslims, we have a little bit of an inferiority. We have a lot of an inferiority complex, to be honest, where we have our eyes looking permanently west and, sort of trying to emulate everything that is there instead of developing the knowledge within ourselves. That is a problem. But we have to still make use of what we have and try to inspire people. And one of the things I want to highlight here is, which I think is really important, is that the internet has opened a new opportunity to study. I can reach a sheikh in Mauritania, a sheikh in Egypt, a sheikh in Saudi, a sheikh in Pakistan, and I can reach them sitting from my own home. I'm not going to say the barakah is the same, but the point is there are opportunities that, Al-Imam al-Bukhari used to travel 60 days, 100 days, 90 days in order to get a hadith. I only have to travel as far as wherever my phone is and open Google. So the reality is there are things that have been made easy for us, but we have to take advantage of them, and that is a challenge for everybody. Now, did any of the other sisters have a question? So these are people who say that they understand the Quran by what? By themselves. This is very serious. And the reason it's serious is our minds differ. What I see to be good and and valid and correct, another person sees to be, they can't understand it or they can't appreciate it. And what they appreciate, I can't appreciate. So that's why the scholars say that the uqul, the minds of people, differ. As for the meaning within the Quran, it doesn't. The meaning within the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jal has a meaning that He intends by His speech. If we get that meaning, we've taken the benefit. If we lose that meaning, we've lost the benefit. It's really important that people take tafsir from reliable sources. And we come back to that statement, that famous statement of Ibn Sirin, إِنَّ هَذَا الْعِلْمَ دِينٌ فَانظُرُوا عَمَّنْ تَأْخُذُونَ دِينَكُمْ. This knowledge you take is your religion, so be careful where you take this knowledge from. This is your religion now. You're going to stand in front of Allah on the Day of Judgment based on this. And the Quran has an understanding which was explained by the Prophet ﷺ to his companions, and they passed it on. Now let me give you an example of that so that people can, because maybe people might say, I don't appreciate what you're saying. So let me give you an example. In the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal in Surah Al-An'am, الذين آمنوا ولم يلبسوا إيمانهم بظلم أولئك لهم الأمن وهم مهتدون. Those who believe and don't mix their belief with oppression. It is they who will have safety, and it is they who are guided. Okay. The Sahaba, when they heard this ayah, notice the Sahaba are the most fluent in Arabic and the most pure at heart. You know, they have no problem in understanding. They understood this ayah to mean that the only people who will be saved from punishment are those who do not sin. So they said, O Messenger of Allah, which of us does not sin? Which of us does not oppress himself? Every one of us oppresses himself. Every one of us does dhulm. So that means none of us will ever be guided, and none of us will ever have safety from the punishment on the Day of Judgment. And the Prophet ﷺ replied to them, it's not as you imagine. It's not as your dhan, as your impression, the idea that you had is wrong. It is as Luqman said to his son, Ya bunayya la tushrik billah, inna shirka la dhulmun azim. O my son, do not make a partner with Allah. Indeed, making partners with Allah is the greatest oppression. So they understood the ayah in a wrong way. And the Prophet ﷺ corrected their understanding. If that was the case of the Sahaba, how about us? They are the ones who are the most pure in speech, the best understanding of Arabic, the closest in terms of purity of the heart, the nearest to the understanding of Islam, and they still understood ayat of the Quran incorrectly. So how about us? And if you look today at some of the worst things that are done in the name of Islam, the killing and the slaughter and the most horrible things that are done in the name of Islam, where did these things come from? Except from a people who read the Quran according to their uqul, according to their intellect, their understanding. And they didn't go back to the people of knowledge. And so they read an ayah and they took it a certain way, and they completely misunderstood, to the point where they started to shed people's blood based on that understanding that they misunderstood from the Quran. For example, they read, وَقْتُلُوهُمْ حَيْثُ ثَقِفْتُمُوهُمْ. Kill them wherever you find them. And they said, this permits us to kill every non-Muslim wherever we find them. This is the example of a people who understood the Quran according to their intellect, instead of understanding it according to the proper understanding. And Allah Azza wa Jal warned us about this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said regarding the Quran, منه آيات محكمات هن أم الكتاب وأخر متشابهات فأما الذين في قلوبهم زيغ فيتبعون ما تشابه منه ابتغاء الفتنة وابتغاء تأويله وما يعلم تأويله إلا الله والراسخون في العلم يقولون آمنا به كل من عند ربنا وما يذكر إلا أولو الألباب. Allah Azza wa Jal said, in this Quran there are ayat that have a single clear meaning. They are the foundation of the Quran. And there are others whose meaning is open to multiple interpretations. As for those who have a disease in their hearts, they follow that which the meaning is unclear, seeking a trial and seeking an interpretation that is pleasing to them. But nobody knows its interpretation except Allah, and those who are rightly guided in knowledge say we believe in it, all of it is from our Lord. So this is another ayah that warns us about interpreting the Quran in the way that suits us. Ibtigha al-fitna wa ibtigha ta'wilih, seeking a ta'wil, a tafsir that suits me, instead of a tafsir that was revealed by Allah Azza wa Jal. The Sunnah is the explanation of the Quran, and the Sahaba explained what we did not understand from the Sunnah, and by this we get the proper tafsir of the Quran, and we achieve what the purpose is, which is to understand what Allah intended by His speech, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Did we have any more, or we're done for the night, inshallah? Okay.
Whether we have discussed that we have to study stages and from the beginning to the start to the intended end. So how do you get the recommendation of this starting books, beginners books?
So I'm putting something together at the moment. I have it already in Arabic, but I don't have it yet ready in English. I'm working on putting something together. And I'm going to try and put it on my website, muhammadtim.com, inshallah ta'ala, when I am, when I have it finished, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. I'm hoping in Ramadan I'll get some time to finish it off. And even to make a project where we take the students through it book by book, it would be really nice, inshallah. For the time being, if you want to get some idea, you could have a look at Kalima's Essentials program, the tapes, the MP3s that came from the program, the first year's program. That gives you an idea of some of the books, but it's only a basic idea. A proper thing, I'm looking at putting together a proper program, inshallah ta'ala, with a list of those beginners' books, inshallah.
What is the MP3 name?
It's called the Essentials. So if you go to SoundCloud and you go to Kalima's SoundCloud, Kalima UAE, their SoundCloud channel, and then you look for the Essentials year 1. There are some suggestions there, but it's not complete from beginning to end. But it's better than nothing, anyways, inshallah.
Another point you discussed that we have to study Arabic language in two ways, or I don't know.
No, I was talking about Arabic language from the point of view of native speakers. So native speakers, they have their study plan, and people who are learning Arabic as a second language, they have a different study plan. So Arabic is a second language, as I said, vocabulary and corpus learning and all the rest. But as for native speakers, they have their own books to study in Arabic, because even if you're a native speaker, you still have to study your grammar and morphology and whatever you call balagha in English. I have no idea what you call balagha in English. It's like eloquence and literary eloquence or something like that. I have no idea what you call it.
Is it not okay to get into the culture, like how children are learning from the people directly? Can we follow the deen that?
That's a technique called immersion learning. Yes, that does work, but it's difficult for adults to do. It's difficult for adults to do. Because ultimately, you get into the culture, you're going to know how to order a coffee and, how to, ask for, I don't know, something in terms of, the culture the people are doing, but you won't learn vocabulary that is, for example, specific to the Quran or things like that. So yes, immersion learning is brilliant. I love immersion learning. I think it's fantastic. But it also isn't practical for everyone. If I said to 100 people, immerse yourself in Arabic and don't speak any English for 6 months, I think probably 95 out of 100 wouldn't be able to do it. So it's about more kind of giving advice that benefits everybody. But yes, I think immersion learning is very practical for those who are able to do it. You go to a country where nobody speaks anything but the language, or you live in a household where nobody speaks anything but the language, and you surround yourself with it until you become comfortable with it. That is definitely something. But this idea of learning from a corpus is also like children learn. It's the same thing of exposing yourself, to a selection of material bit by bit. That's a very similar concept, inshallah. So we stopped.
This series of books you were speaking about, in English, you said that Oxford for
Yeah.
children. I think in Arabic there are some Ali's or something, Ali's series in Arabic.
There's so many. There's more than one for sure. But
Available in Dubai public libraries.
I'm sure, and I think even GILC here have some upstairs. I think even upstairs here they have it. They have a complete set from beginning to end, or they had last year. They had a set. So you might try. I can't remember what the name of it is though. Okay, we'll stop there, inshallah. Anyone else who has any questions can just catch me as I go out. And Allah Azza wa Jal knows best. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.